Hi, everybody. My name is Angie Abdou. Welcome to the final session of the 24th Annual Saskatchewan Festival of Words. So I hope everyone's had a really great festival, and I really want to congratulate Sarah Simonson and the whole team for moving to the virtual format. It seems like from a spectator's point of view and a participant point of view, it feels like it's gone very, very smoothly with no problems at all. But having worked behind the scenes at other events, I'm sure doing something so new on this amount of notice came with its challenges. So a real big congratulations to the whole festival team for pulling this off. And I know I speak for all of the audiences when I say I'm so glad that they managed to run a festival despite all the challenges in our current environment. It's been really wonderful connecting with writers whatever way we can. And the sessions that I've seen have been fantastic. So welcome to the final session. And we're going to be talking about Saskatchewan literary culture. Did I introduce myself? My name is Angie Abdou. I'm born and raised Moose Javian. My parents were also raised in Moose Jaw, so I think of Saskatchewan as home, even though I now live in the Rocky Mountains along the Alberta-BC border. But I do come back to the festival whenever I get a chance. I've missed very few over the 24 years, and I'm looking forward hopefully to next year, which will hopefully be back in person. And so at the end of today's session, today's 1 hour, don't be too quick to hang up, because after we're all done, I have some announcements, including some of the lineup for the 25th anniversary edition of this festival. But before we get started, I'm going to begin by acknowledging that the festival is located on Treaty 4 territory, the original lands of the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Saulteaux, the Dakota, the Nakota, the Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect and honor the treaties made on all territories and acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past. We're committed to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous nations in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. The festival also wants to emphasize that we're dedicated to making this a safe space for anyone, so hateful language will not be tolerated in the events or on the online chat. I'm coming to you not from Treaty 4 territory, but from the homelands of the Ktunaxa people. Finally, before we get started, an extra big thanks to the sponsors. This year, I'm sure there were some concerns that sponsors might back out since there wasn't the traditional face-to-face event. So we really want to thank sponsors who stepped up and supported continuing the event in this format. The festival couldn't happen without the sponsors. So a big thank you to the Saskatchewan Arts Board and Saskatchewan Culture, as well as a long list of businesses which are in the program and will come up on screen at the end of the event. If you are in Moose Jaw and you have a chance to visit these businesses and tell them how much you appreciate the support and how much the festival means to the city of Moose Jaw, that would be much appreciated by us. And it fits with today's theme of Saskatchewan literary culture, of which this festival is a very big part. We're going to start with some readings. And so I'll introduce each of the writers, and then each of the writers will read for 5 minutes. First, Paul Seesequasis has volunteered to go first. He's dialing in from Saskatoon. Paul is Willow Cree, and he is a writer, a journalist, and a cultural advocate. Some of you will have heard his earlier talk yesterday or the day before, where he spoke of his mother being one of the country's first Indigenous nurses. And so her work meant that he grew up in cities, but he's always interested in the way she talked about the resilience and strength of her people and how that wasn't represented in some of the current conversations, and that this book of his, which has seen so much, has received so much acclaim. It began as an archival project to collect Indigenous images of strength and resilience and living off the land. It's a beautiful, moving, inspiring collection of photographs. Eden Robinson calls it a revelatory work of astonishing grace. Thomas King says, Blanket Toss Under the Midnight Sun is a wonderful collection of found photographs and recovered histories that link us to a past as old as the land and as precious as breath. So thank you very much for Paul for joining us, and he is now going to read.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much, Andrew. And can you hear me? Everyone can hear me all right, I hope. Those are very kind words, and I very much appreciate it. Appreciate them, Angie, and also the people who read the book and the people who joined the session that I gave a couple of days ago as part of the festival. And I'm just very honored to be able to partake in this online event again, and for all the people who have, I guess, quote unquote, tuned in. Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun is based on Indigenous archival photos from generally the 30s to the late 70s. And I've tried to tie a story or narrative with each of these photos. So what I'm going to read is just a short bit about a woman called Mary Micmac. She was an Anishinaabe woman let me just find her here. I don't know if you can see that on the screen, but she's there with her nephew in the canoe. And it's one of my favorite stories because she happened to, the photographer John McPhee happened to be at Lake St. Joseph just on the day, heard about her, and happened to be at the lake just on the day she came in. She was a traditional woman who lived entirely on the land and only came into town once or twice a year to pick up supplies, things that she might need. So without further ado, I'll read that. In 1949, while working at Osnaburg House, originally the site of a trading post on Lake St. Joseph, John McPhee, photographer and field worker with the Ontario Department of Land and Forests, heard of a woman who reportedly lived an old-style traditional lifestyle. He was told this woman of the land would come to Osnaburg only once a month to pick up her old age security benefit and sundry supplies at the local Hudson's Bay Company store. At the time in Osnaburg, as in remote northern villages, the Hudson's Bay Company store was a place to buy goods as the local post office and a place to contact a doctor via radio. So it played a very important function. Intrigued by the story of this woman, John McPhee went to Lake St. Joseph to meet her on one of her trips into town. In the photographs he took that day, using his Zeiss contact for color slides and a roller code for black and white, she is seen arriving with her grandson and also paddling up and down the shoreline. Her name, McPhee found out, was Marie Mickenack. Mickenack spoke no English, and McPhee spoke only a few words and phrases in Cree, so they communicated mainly through body and sign language. Marie Mickenack was Anishinaabe and lived largely on rabbits, fish, berries, and manoman, wild rice, when it could be obtained. When he met her, Mickenack was probably in her late 60s. Her canoe was made of birch bark, well crafted and sturdy, and her paddle was she had also handmade, likely carved from spruce. At that time, few people were making canoes anymore out of birch bark, McPhee told me. They were mostly all replaced by commercial canoes, chestnut canoes, which the Hudson's Bay Company handled and sold, made in New Brunswick. Mickenack's canoe was entirely of her own making, with patchworks and repairs added from time to time as needed. Quote, I noticed one spot where she had repaired a tear with a wire nail or two and some cotton twine, he said. McPhee moved to another part of Ontario soon after and never saw or heard of Marie Mickenack again. Presumably, she went on living off the land, harvesting, snaring, fishing, hunting, the food she needed, and using her skills, making and repairing what she had built from the resources offered by the land. And so that's the story of Marie Mickenack. It's also one of my favorite stories in the book because without that meeting, she would have disappeared into history. No one would have known of her without McPhee being there to take these photos. So I'm happy to have shared that story with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul. I should say when I mentioned that the book is images of strength and resilience and living off the land, it's also images of happiness. There's so much joy in some of these photos. I'm just going to hold up the book for everybody who hasn't seen it, but it's a beautiful book. It even I like the weight of it and the feel of it. I like books as objects, and this one is just a lovely book. And Nelson did a wonderful job yesterday in his interview with you, or the day before yesterday, of capturing how important the writing is too. So beautiful writing, beautiful images, and congratulations on a very special book. Next, Bernadette Wagner. Everybody in Moose Jaw knows Bernadette. I don't think I've ever been to a festival that I haven't seen her smiling face at. And there's a lot of things I'm missing. I could actually probably get pretty emotional about this if I let myself, but there is a lot of things I'm missing about being in Moose Jaw right now this weekend. And Bernadette is one of them. So I'm glad that I get to see her face on screen. She shows up all the time. She's there. And as I was researching, I've known Bernadette for a long time through the connection with the festival. But as I was researching what to say about her in her bio, I was astonished by that the festival is not the only thing she shows up for all the time. She's got her hand in every Saskatchewan writing thing there is and other Saskatchewan arts things, from the Writers Guild to Sage Hill to St. Peter's Abbey to arts festivals in Regina that I haven't even heard of. So Bernadette comes to us from Regina today. She's a mainstay of the Saskatchewan writing community and a regular in a number of Saskatchewan writing institutions and a fierce advocate for social justice in her writing, her nonfiction writing, as well as in other work she does. She's published with Athabasca University Press, which is my place of work. So I was happy to see you included in those collections. And here is her most recent poetry book called The Dry Valley. And it's set in 3 Saskatchewan locations by a section, the Mixed Grasslands, Regina, Saskatchewan, and the Qu'Appelle Valley. And that's what she's going to read from us today. So welcome, Bernadette.
Thank you, Angie. It is so good to see you. And it's my honor and privilege to be here with Bruce and Paul and you at this fantastic festival. Thank you, Sarah and team. In my reading the other day, I read mostly land poems. So this time I thought I'd just feature a couple of, I write about more than just the land. Not that the land is just, anyway, I'll read now. Learning to sew. Before grade 1 starts, Auntie takes hold of the fabric, shakes out wrinkles while the tape measure jiggles, uneven around her neck. She snaps the fold into place and lays the paisley cloth on her dining room table, then pins thin pieces of paper marked with words and lines I cannot read. But I know my letters and numbers, see A and B and C and 1 and 2. And then she scissors the paper, stopping to go around the dark diamond bumps that tell her where to put the pieces together. I'm too small to cut, she says. Her scissors are very sharp. So I watch until the last one is cut. Her needle and thread mark special spots she needs to line up buttons and darts that don't have points. Soon she is at the sewing machine, not the old foot pump one, but her new one, the electric, and she's zipping along. No swear words from her, not like when Mummy's sewing. She tells me to try it on. But there's no sleeves, I say. The picture has sleeves. And she laughs, tells me they'll come later. She needs to make sure this fits first. I think it does, but she pinches the joined parts and says it needs to come in a bit at the yoke. Whatever that is, there's no eggs here, so I do as I'm told, take it off and get dressed. Auntie sews some more, and I color in her book of animals. Enough, she says, after a while. It's time to make supper. When I look at her, she says not to worry. We'll do more later. We'll have it done before Mum comes to pick me up tomorrow. And it is. That was from the first section. And this is my Me Too poem in the second section of the book. The body remembers. It's a blade teasing my arm, a white lie, the line of possibility quickening. My body remembers, memory fog, a quivering spine, the fragment. Go away, I can't even. But there he is, and here I am, and I can't, and there's blood, so much. Bloody, hurting pieces of me shivering. Red cheeks hot, hold tears. Can't cry, crybaby. Yes, you can, little one. That line from his finger to you, nothing compared to the 3 pointing back at him. Rage, rage, march, march, injustice, privileged male power. A courtroom, the accused quiet, while accusers endure dissection. No perfect witness in a survivor. The headline should read, Urgent Actions Taken in Response to Study by Stats Canada. Subheading, 4 in 5 women live with personal knowledge of a sexual crime. Our voices loud, our body remembering. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. That poem hurts my heart. It's very powerful. Thank you for sharing. Seems like a digression, but I just watched the new Netflix movie called Athlete A about the abuse of gymnasts in the USA gymnastics. And the rage in your poem, you will feel that if you watch that movie. It's astonishing what people have gotten away with. even where children are involved. So thank you for that poem. I felt when I read your collection, you've just read 2 dark poems, so this seems like an odd comment, but your collection made me very nostalgic. Now I'm speaking of the land poems, not the poems about alcoholism and the land. I live in the Rocky Mountains, which is one of the most beautiful places in the world, and people come from all over the world to see them. But to me, the prairies are just as stunning. And when I drive out of the mountains and into the prairies and the sky opens up and the light, it's just, I just love it. So your collection made me feel all of that. Thank you. And our last reader is going to be Bruce Rice, who is a perfect participant in this panel about Saskatchewan literary culture because he is the Saskatchewan Poet Laureate. His recent book, The Vivian Poems, Street Photographer Vivian Meyer, is his 6th book. He's also published children's books and has a long list of accolades to his name, including a Canadian Authors Association Award and 2 Saskatchewan Book Awards. Of Bruce's latest poetry collection, Barry Dempster says, "Beautiful work, deep and full of consolation, intelligent and richly arranged." I also agree with the Saskatchewan Book Awards jury that claimed Bruce Rice is a master of light. It's as if every poem is a new way of seeing. Please welcome Bruce. Oh, you're on mute, Bruce. Just.
There we go. Probably people like to put me on mute a lot more often. Thanks, Paul and Bernadette and Angie for this. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Vivian Meyer, I should show the book if I can, was a street photographer. She's called a street photographer, but she, some people know her story. She worked as a nanny for often for well-to-do families in Chicago. And when 2 years before she passed away in 2007, a bunch of her work was found, basically negatives, over 140,000 black and white negatives were found in a storage locker auction in Chicago. And there were other things. It's a long story, but she kept her work. She was never, she never showed her work. And what I like to do is read from a long piece. There's called Human River, which I was hoping would be the original title for the book, but then people's distributors said, you know, if you don't say these are poems, people think they're buying a photography book and trouble will follow. So this is Human River. These are 4 different people based on some of her photographs. The man in Bryant Park, and this is all in New York proof sheets of Vivian Meyer. The man in Bryant Park. I used to love the snowy breath of Manhattan, the cloak she drew about men like me. The wooden hearts of trees survive this slush of age. The cold air has changed my lungs. A face in the skim of ice gapes back at me. I used to fly down a river, verglass so thin if you stopped, you break through. My scrolling blades flashed like the backs of salmon we chased upstream. This weather teaches an avenue of empty benches as younger men in better coats than mine whisk by. I must look confused, as if I've arrived in someone else's future. Its insouciant hour and the remains of a daydream no longer in love with what lies ahead. Drunk. Man, if I was Stan Laurel, this would be hilarious. Creeps gawking as his cop, nice cop tunic, leads me away. Check out my legs, scabs to the knees. My mouth strangely has nothing to say, just a garbled complaint. Whoever the hell you are, you're just one more stranger who's done nothing for me. Startled as I am, me and this cop fall into a pose, arrested by a novel kind of humiliation. And this is actually as close as I can come to a love poem. Most of mine turn out like German manners films with bad lighting. But anyway, this is called Passengers. Love, the world slows for the phrase of my snowy shirt and that shadow in the cove of your throat. Steel shoes of our dappled gray ring on the avenue. In an open carriage, we are immaculate. Framed in fenders of parked cars, in daylight drawn from a modest star, whose far-removed planet, half mystery, pushes off from the dark and the blue. Its elliptical silence, a transit our bodies studied so long and still weren't prepared for. And the final one is kind of after a famous Rainer Maria Rilke poem called Der Panther, or This Panther he saw in Jardin des Plantes in Paris. But anyway, this is Vivian's image of this domestic cleaning a window. A domestic washing windows in her employer's brownstone stands on the broad granite sill, rag in her hand as she reaches over the frame, which could be the bars of a cage. The poet warns, 1,000 steel bars and no world beyond. But humble or great, who's to judge what poets know of the light in the heart of a panther, or the contents of any life but their own? So
Thank you. It's a beautiful reading. Oh, there's applause that we learned. This is the signal for applause. Very, very nice. Thank you. And this is also a beautiful book, book as object. And I had a general question I wanted to start with, but it occurs to me, since both you and Bernadette have published with Radiant Press, who's a fairly new press, and we're talking about Saskatchewan literary culture. And of course, we've recently experienced the loss of a very traditional press that's been around forever. We'll talk about that soon, but let's start on a positive note. Tell me a little bit about Radiant Press and why they started and what role they fill in Saskatchewan and how it was working with them. 3 questions in one for both of you.
Well, we'll tag team Bernadette maybe.
Sure.
Radiant Press, it's a couple in Regina here who bought the back list of the former Hagias Press, but it's husband and wife team, and it's Deborah Bell and John as well. So John is a former filmmaker, but they've started this press, but they seem to be, it's been going for about 4 years, I think, Bernadette.
Somewhere around there.
Yeah. And they have been sort of growing, I think. They've been trying to expand in ways that I haven't really seen other presses do. I've done, I think, 3, an online book launch, of course, but 2 other videos with John. And they seem to be very keen about finding new ways of promoting the work, very committed to, I think, they've brought in some new mixture of new writers and some established ones. So that's good to see. And we have some great designers in this province, and certainly they've got a great one in Tanya. But Bernadette, maybe you've got some more to throw in there.
Well, they have done a lot for me, and maybe it's because it's my second book. I don't know, but audiobook. They're producing an audiobook of the Dry Valley, so that's exciting. And they've put some videos up on YouTube from my launch. They're okay with supporting me in the creation of a video poem. I just have to go for the funding, and they'll support me in that. So they've been wonderful. They've been really wonderful.
Yeah.
And do they focus on Saskatchewan writers? Is that their mandate or not?
I don't know if that's part of the mandate or not.
But you said, I
Quite
think
frankly.
they did buy the backlist of the Saskatchewan writers from Cadeau.
Mhm.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
great.
Which, of course, were from everywhere. I don't think they are specifically Saskatchewan focused, but of course,
Well,
we're here.
I launched with Victor Enns,
Oh, there you
who's
go.
in
Manitoba.
Manitoba. Yeah. So
now let me back up to the question I meant to start with, which is a more general question. I just like to hear all of you say, what does Saskatchewan literary culture, what does that phrase even mean to you? And how is it important to you as an artist and to your work, your literary work?
Okay. Paul, maybe
you want to maybe start?
Okay, gladly. Thanks, Angie. What does Saskatchewan literary culture mean to me? It means several things on several levels. I guess firstly, it means a very vibrant writing scene, as we know. It's been around for a few decades now. It means prairie voices. It means wide open spaces, I guess, which I think feed the imagination in a unique way. So I think in many ways, I view writing, not just writing, but all creative acts as being very much shaped by the land or the place that you're creating from. And I think Saskatchewan has had that kind of impact here, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, or poetry. I also think Saskatchewan is a changing landscape. Certainly in my time, both here in Saskatchewan and when I've traveled abroad or away from Saskatchewan, the number of Indigenous writers has really grown from when I was young. When I was young, there was Maria Campbell, maybe Jeanette Armstrong, a few other people. Now there are dozens, and I could spend 20 minutes just naming names, right? And I'd probably be missing a whole bunch of people coming up. But I think of Dawn Dumont, Tenille Campbell, a whole bunch of other writers, Randy Bundy, etc. So there's this wonderful, diverse Indigenous writing community. The other thing I think of when I'm thinking of Saskatchewan literary culture is its changing face, or its changing nature. New Canadians, the emergent Black voice on the prairies that we have not read enough about in the past. So I also see a very shift in what people think of when they think of quote unquote Saskatchewan writing or prairie writing. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Well, I agree with a lot of what Paul said, and I have to say that I'm a late bloomer as a writer. So I was down east for 10 years before I came back to Saskatchewan, and I just sort of tiptoed into the writing community. And on the ground here, there is a terrific network, and I don't want to mythologize too much, but it's I think what happened was we were isolated, and the only way to get, if you wanted to be a writer or publisher, the only way to do it was to do it yourself. And it sort of fit, I think, with the way that small communities work. And while we've got Regina, Saskatoon, there's a lot going on in smaller places. One thing I would like to say, though, is just about, and this is what I tell people I'm on the, at meetings of the Writers Union of Canada and places like that, is that the explosion of Indigenous writing in this country is one of the biggest things happening in Canadian publishing right now. But in the prairies, there's some unique circumstances. In Manitoba, it's 1 in 5 people are Indigenous. First Nation, Métis. Saskatchewan, it's 1 in 6. Alberta, the percentage is different, but the numbers are there. And so what it means, I think, is that we have this core of Indigenous writing, and I don't think that the critics have caught up with what's going on. I think it's transforming Canadian literature, and and we're just really fortunate to be here in the midst of this, because on paper this sounds great, but as writers, these are small communities still, and so we all know each other. So we have these personal connections, not just with writers, but with artists and across the different disciplines. And I know if you go up into northern communities, I know I was up in the Ranch last fall, and the artists, Indigenous, non-Indigenous writers and artists, that's all kind of part of that same group that other people in bigger cities are wishing that they had. And so I don't want to say this is, like Shangri-La or anything like that, but we've got this core of things happening here that are not happening, I don't think, in some of the bigger places where everything's so fragmented. And it's a wonderful thing. And I'm just saying, as a writer, it just pushes me imaginatively. Like when you're making more room at the table, you're making more room for everyone. And for me, that's great having that happening. Even, I move in and out of my concerns as a writer, but it's great to see that going on.
It's good to hear you say that you think it's special, because I have left, of course. And so for me, I sometimes wonder, am I romanticizing Saskatchewan literary culture? Because to me, it feels like a big family and there's so much energy, and
You're stealing my words, Angie.
Sorry, I'm most attached to it, and I think I'm just
Language.
romanticizing it because I've left. So it's good to hear you say. And Bernadette, you agree, I guess?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's all about community. This writing community in Saskatchewan is the reason I'm a writer. I came from the women's movement where it was all about politics and and then I stepped my toes in here and it's still about community. I had to learn the different pieces of the community and I love how the community is now opening so much more than it did. And I think what really helped was back in when I first became a member of the Guild, the Saskatchewan Writers Guild in the early 90s, we had an Indigenous officer then. And then politics played in, and the federal government cut the funding for that position. So we lost Barb. And then it wasn't until just a few years ago that we finally got that funding back. And how absolutely crucial it is that we, as a provincial writers organization, have that broader scope. We also are fortunate in that we've had the Arts Board. I don't think we could say anything about our community without talking about the Arts Board. And then our publishers group, like we have how many publishers in this province? It must be getting close to 70 now, doing all kinds of publishing, whether it's cookbooks or poetry or local histories or fiction. And they're award-winning authors. We're producing award-winning authors. Sage Hill, we've got a great community and it builds writers and we're recognized all across the country. I've heard it from people all across the country. So we can brag, Bruce, we can brag.
And I think, tell me if I'm romanticizing this, but I think that prairie writers support each other. And I said this, so I'm going to put Saskatchewan and Manitoba together because I feel like it. But I mean, so said yesterday in Joan's event that when I hear that she's won the Governor General's or the Amazon First Novel or whatever she's winning, I never feel that envy that is the writer's curse. I always feel so pleased, like, hey, as if we're on the same team, like Joan did it. And I think the same. I don't feel envious of Guy Vanderhey or Don Dumont or any. When Saskatchewan prairie writers get recognition, I feel like we're kind of all on the same team and happy for each other. Would you say that's fair, or might be romantic again?
I think you're absolutely bang on.
And I think it's because that, so much of the publishing happens in Toronto, and in Saskatchewan, we're so far removed from that. So we're all on the same team together trying to, whatever attention anyone gets is like good for all of us.
I was at this is dating me really back at Fort Capel at Summer School of the Arts, and they brought Gordon Lish, who was a big editor. He edited Raymond Carver, for example, and that type of thing. And he shows up in his Italian, his Australian, hat with the thing on the side, and his khaki suits and his expensive boots. And he explains to us how there's this basically a capitalist theory of writing. Basically, you be an SOB, and you don't mind who you have to shove out of your way. And it was very clear then that there is a certain element of the publishing world that is like that. But it's very clear there's, you have to decide which way you're going to go. And I think we have gone with a more cooperative approach just because if we don't, we're all sunk.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to ask you, I'm going to give you my own answer while you think, but I wanted to talk about why it's important to have a provincial literary culture. Like, why can't we all just be Canadians and we're part of Canadian literature? Why do we have to distinguish that? And I'll tell you why. For me, when I grew up loving books and wanting desperately to be a writer, but it just didn't seem like a real thing that people could be. And I went to university and sort of gradually found my way studying English literature. And I remember the first time I met real live writers, and it was in Joan Givner's class. Joan Givner, a feature of Canadian or Saskatchewan literature as well. But she invited in two different writers, and it was Sharon Butella and Gail Bowen. So I saw real writers, like these women were real writers, and they were publishing books, and they were writing about Regina, and they were writing about the prairie. And it only occurred to me then that people could write about things that I knew, and that could be what they did. And I don't know if I would have ever tried without those influences. And I think in terms of inspiring artists to come from a place, there needs to be that community and those models and those people speaking for it. Because if we only see people writing about Toronto, it doesn't occur to kids that, well, I can do this too.
Yeah. For me, there was nothing quite like hearing Lorna Crozier on Peter Zosky's morning radio show
Yes.
from Saskatchewan. Oh,
Talk
you
about the
mean
sex
Peter
lives
from
of vegetables.
Yeah, it was remarkable. The first, like, I came to writing as an adult as well.
Did you guys have influences like that were Saskatchewan artists that made you think, oh, we can do this?
Well, for me, one of the things that happened here, first of all, I think it's important for people to see when you go into a community as a writer from here, you're validating everything that goes on. You're validating the writers and the artists in those communities. And that's why it's important for me to get out of Regina and Saskatoon and go places. But a lot of my influences as writers were actually not from Saskatchewan. It was like Saskatchewan people put it together. But in the early days, there was no, there's a fine arts, an MFA in fine arts that you can finally get in writing here. And it's a small program, very good. But we brought in the best writers in the country, and they love coming here because we look after them, and they meet people, and they eat our pierogies, whatever. But I actually had the privilege of learning from the very best writers in the country because we were not stopped by the borders about who we wanted to bring in. So we said, what the hell, we'll bring in the best we can find. And so I think that's part of the writing ethic here, is that if you look at Anne Lazurko was just reading from a book a few days ago, and I sort of forget which country, Indonesia. Yeah, and Indonesia, and other writers of Russia, China. Lots of people have been to China. With Saskatchewan was the first place to be sending people in numbers to China, and so we were great travelers. So a lot of what I learned, the people I learned from, were the instructors that were brought in because we were all at the same point. And for the Saskatchewan writers, a lot of what I'm really inspired by is how people walk through the world, because a lot of writing is about how you conduct yourself in the community and what you think writing is. Like Paul does a ton. He's doing a huge service with what he's doing with his work. And it's about how you move through the world, not just what you put on the paper. You too, Bernadette. Bernadette is a workhorse for Saskatchewan. I want to say that right now.
I realized that when I looked up her bio. She is a workhorse. Paul, would you agree that it's important to have a provincial literary culture that's distinct from the national one? And are there influences within that community that shaped what you ended up doing?
Well, I totally, and what Bruce has said and what Bernadette said earlier. Canada is a very diverse nation state, and whether it's Newfoundland, whether it's Saskatchewan, whether it's Montreal, they're completely different places. So the literature needs coming from those places is distinct and shaped by those places. So it definitely is important. For me, I think my main influence, I think, as a young person, was Maria Campbell. Half Breed had just come out in the early 70s, and I think it still is a seminal work. It's just been reissued with some parts that were taken out of the original original version have been put back in. So I think that Maria Campbell's work was really an influence for me. But also, I think also when I look at the Indigenous literary scene, I think we also have to look at beyond the page. I also look at someone like Frida Hennique, who worked on language and oral tradition, and that really is an important aspect of Indigenous literature. And so if we're just thinking of it on the page, we're only seeing a part of the picture of what an Indigenous literature is. So for me, it's always been that kind of blending between oral narrative and the written word, and finding a transference or a meeting place for those to come together. But just recognizing that Saskatchewan Indigenous literature is oral based as well, as much as it is on the page. So That's kind of why I see it unique here, and why I feel that the specific landscape of Saskatchewan has shaped Indigenous writers, but also shaped everyone who's come here. And we talked about this earlier, the space, the skies, all those things that we think of when we think of Saskatchewan. Thank you.
Yeah. We've talked in passing about some of the institutions that we're referring to when we talk about Saskatchewan literary culture, and I want to make sure that we talk at greater length about some of these before we run out of time, which happens all too fast. Because some people listening might not know when we mention Sage Hill or we mention St. Peter's Abbey or we mention the Writers Guild, what they all do. So I was thinking if we could each just pick one and talk, or even Cotto Books for the history of that. So well, you three think about which ones you might like to pick. I'll speak briefly to the Saskatchewan Festival of Words, which I think is a major institution in Saskatchewan literary culture. I know David Carpenter, another institution of Saskatchewan literary culture. He has encyclopedias about things about Saskatchewan literature. And Tracy Hammond wrote an essay about the Saskatchewan diaspora. So I finally feel included because I'm in the Saskatchewan diaspora. So I still get to call Saskatchewan home. But part of why I can is because I come home every year to the festival. And that gives me a grounding point to come home. And I know I'm going to see Jerry Hill. And I know I'm going to see Bernadette. And I know I'm going to see Tracy Hammond and David Carpenter. And everybody's there. And so you feel a part of that community. And it also, I started coming, the very first one, I was going to graduate school in Ontario, and I heard there's a Gary Highland is starting a festival in Moose Jaw. And so I came home for it. And then I came home every year, and it made me think, I want to be a writer, and I want one day to be invited to this festival in my hometown. And I like watching people interview authors, and I would like to do that as a way to contribute to the conversation and the discussion around Prairie books. So it really shaped who I am as a grown-up. And it's I always joke that Gary Highland made my hometown cool, because before Gary Highland, there was no festival, there was no cultural center. That's him, So, and Bob Curry was so central in all of that, who was a teacher at the school that I graduated from. So Moose Jaw and the Saskatchewan Festival of the Arts is a big part of what I mean when I talk about the Saskatchewan literary culture. If you could each add one sort of institution or group, that would be great. I know we're not going to cover them all, but Paul, do you want to go first? Oh.
Okay, just very briefly, I know our time is becoming an issue. I just want to mention the Saskatoon Indigenous Poets Society, because they do wonderful work here in town, very grassroots, a lot of young people. When we're talking poetry, it could be slam, it could be spoken word, it's across, it's really across the board. And they hold bi-weekly or weekly readings here. Obviously, everything is on hold with the pandemic, but up to that point in time, weekly readings here in the community, and really have done outreach here, especially here on the West End in Riversdale. So I want to give a shout out to them because I think the work they do is just incredible.
They do incredible work. Kevin is involved in that group, I believe, and he was at Sage Hill when I was there studying with Ken Badstock. I don't want to talk about Sage Hill, though. I actually want to talk about St. Peter's Abbey because it's a fascinating facility that I had a really difficult time my first 2 years there, being the bit of a radical feminist I was back then, but 20 years ago now. I had to reconcile my feelings about the Catholic Church before I could actually write there. And it was through a conversation with my long dead grandmother that I was able to come to some kind of resolution, because she was a devout Christian. So since then, like, every poem and everything I've ever published has been worked on there, because I go back every year for some time there through the Saskatchewan Writers Guild retreats program. And then when I was doing edits on my first book, I took some time there just to finish those edits. And it's a really welcoming community, very open, but closed now because of COVID. So I'm thinking of people like Lorna Crozier, who goes there every year for her time in Saskatchewan, and how it is without that Saskatchewan sky.
I got an email from Lorna yesterday, and here I go getting emotional again, but she's heartbroken to be at St. Peter's Abbey.
I bet she is.
To her work. Yeah.
Maybe I'll talk a bit about the Writers Guild. I was president at one point in history, and that happened because 5 minutes before the AGM, they still hadn't found a candidate, and I would hanging around the Xerox machine too long and got pressed into service. So anyway, you know, the when I talked before that there were things in this province we had to do ourselves. There was no like publishers down east weren't interested in Saskatchewan publishing because who wants to hear about the sun coming up over the grain elevator? We didn't have the critical mass, so that's how Cato and a lot of the other presses got started. But the guild, of course, got started at a famous meeting down at Fort Capel and Fort San. A lot of people involved, but it was really writers just put it together from scratch. When I think I was 85 or somewhere in that ballpark, I was president, and they were going through changes. But one of the things that the Writers Guild always did was reach out across the province. And I know when I became president, some other writers organizations would not accept a beginning writer, somebody who'd never written before or was just interested. And it was kind of like one of the reasons we have so many writers in this province is we're kind of like the same reason the Montreal Canadiens had one of the great teams of all time, because they had a great farm team. They invested in the farm team, and that's what happens. And we had no rules about how to do this, but I think at the end of the day, writing any kind of art is community development, and that's kind of the approach that happened. And the Writers Guild, I will say, has been through ups and downs, like every other organization, some tougher than others. But at the end of the day, it seems to have come through just because I think the size of the base and the diversity of the base, there's a tremendous amount of talent. One of the things that I miss from those earlier days was the connection with our sister guilds on both sides, on Manitoba and Alberta. And I don't think those connections are as strong now as they used to be. I think the publishers' connections among the publishers, from what I'm told, are better. But that's something I feel like one of the things we need to get back. But I also want to say is that for a long time, because the guild was so strong, I think the government and others thought that everything that happened should happen through the guild because it's easy to manage. But actually, the diversity of things like the festival, like things like Sage Hill Writing Experience, like the Saskatoon, is it Aboriginal poets? Did you say, Paul?
Indigenous poets, yeah.
Indigenous poets, yeah. And some of that stuff, actually, what it's meant is that it's allowed the writing to evolve. So not everything has to come from this one organization, but yet I think we talk in ways that often I don't see it as a kind of competitive thing. That's really works well. And I think it's actually one of the strengths that you can go across the province and find different groups, but they're still connected in some way. And that's been through effort. It hasn't necessarily come easily.
Great, thank you. We have questions already coming up, so I'm going to read those. But before I do, I'll just say briefly, because we've mentioned Sage Hill a few times, that for people who don't know, the Sage Hill Writing Experience is a writer's retreat where there's sessions on poetry, fiction, nonfiction, and then there's master's classes and all of those as well. And you apply to get in. And when I went, it was 10 days, so it's a bit longer than most of them. And it was on a friar's retreat near Lumsden. I think it's moved a bit, but
it's moved to St. Peter's now.
St. Peter's. So you stay completely all together, and you have a leader, instructor, and you work on your manuscript. And a lot of Saskatchewan writers have spent time there, both as students and as teachers. Joan and I mentioned yesterday that we met there working on our first books. I was working on The Bone Cage, and she was working on Reading by Lightning. So before either of us had published, we were there at Sage Hill. So it's a very important place for Saskatchewan writers too, and writers around the country come. The first question is, I would like to hear Paul's thoughts on the writing community in Saskatchewan as an overall team from the perspective of Saskatchewan Indigenous writers. So I mentioned that it seems like a team and we all support each other. Could you speak to that from the perspective of Saskatchewan Indigenous writers?
I I don't have the background in terms of the positions that were mentioned, with the Indigenous officer or
Program officer.
program officer at the Writers Guild, which, was there, then wasn't there because of funding. So I'm not going to speak on that kind of detail level, but I think what we've seen is a shift or a change. And Bruce had mentioned this earlier in terms of the growth of Indigenous literature. And I think that has shifted a dynamic where I think you're seeing more of a cross respect, recognition, acceptance being brought in to the general writing community within Saskatchewan. So I do see, I am optimistic on that level in terms of future relations between the Indigenous writing community and the non-Indigenous writing community in this province. And I'm not going to say it's not, because I also see there's a shift in the demographics of this province as well, which isn't just Indigenous. There's populations of peoples who have come in from all parts of the world in the past couple of decades. So that is also going to shift the literary landscape. So I'm seeing an overall shifting happening, which will reflect the demographics and the culture and the relationships within this province. So I see it as part of an overall shift that's taking place right now.
Yeah. Paul, if I can add something to that. You've mentioned the people who are new to the province, and I think that's one of the areas where we have quite a steep learning curve. As a province, until the last 10 years or so, we didn't have a lot of immigration. We had a refugee population, but we didn't have a lot of people coming to the province to live and work. And that's a whole set of I think an area that hasn't really, it's just starting to be addressed. We're starting to see some writers emerge. We're starting to see some people, but we have a lot to learn, and just as a province, let alone in the arts community. So I think that's sort of goes across the board for the Saskatchewan as a province.
If I could jump in for just 1 second, I want to. I feel remiss if I didn't mention the work done by the University of Regina Press. It released an anthology of Black voices from Black writers from Saskatchewan. So I think that kind of thing we're starting to see that shift. I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and
the University of Regina Press is doing great work, really. Yeah. The next question, just so we don't leave anyone off, is it's great that adults in Saskatchewan have such wonderful community to be a part of. How do you see these writers connecting with youth, especially from our rural communities? And I will just give a really brief answer before putting it over to people, is that Sage Writers has a teen experience, and in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan, and Regina, for sure, at least. And the Saskatchewan teen experience is associated with the festival. And I know I taught at it for almost 10 years, but it's been going strong for a long time. Yeah, and so that's one way. And I'm not so sure about the rural communities. Can anyone else speak?
I'll talk about it. Well, the Writers Guild has a fantastic program where teachers in the school system can invite authors into their schools. So I've done a lot of that, connecting with youth. And Windscript magazine is a publication by the Saskatchewan writers, and it's all high school writing, teen writing. I've had the great gift of editing that one year, and I think Bruce was an instigator in getting that publication going.
Yep.
So I'll toss that over to him.
Spring was that's the name of it, right? Spring is the Writers Guild.
No, that's the emerging. That's the emerging.
That's where I published my first story, is in Spring, which is the Emerging Writers Journal.
Me too.
Guild.
Me too.
Which is so important for young writers to have this place to place the first story and get really detailed editing.
Yeah, Windscript was the name of the magazine, and actually Victor Jared Enns was executive director of the Writers Guild when that happened. And I have to say there was some resistance to, well, we're an organization of writers for adults, but like I say, the Montreal Canadiens, if you want to produce writers, you start with a farm team. But also, I think for young writers, things are emerging like I think that spoken word, I'm a big fan of it. I actually started out doing improvised drama, and then I became a writer later. So poetry is basically somebody talking. So when I started, that's what my original poetry was like. But now, between what's going on online these days, spoken word, which has reached, I'd say that right now there's maybe feels like there's maybe been about a 10% overlap between more traditional page writers and spoken word, but there's different forms happening now. And one of the things that they do more in the States than we have been doing here is DIY, do it yourself publishing. But there's a lot of that starting to happen, and it's with existing established writers. But I think as new writers come through the system, we're going to see a lot more of that. And
Well, just to speak to that, Bruce, it's one of the reasons I started the mini publishing company, the micro press that I did, was because there were no opportunities. It was before spring came out. So there were so many of us who talked to each other as women who were not finding publication. So I just, when I came back from Sage Hill after working with Betsy Warland, decided that I was going to publish a chapbook. So that went over really well. So then I published something like 20 or 25, but chapbooks in all, and three at a time. And I always had one of my own because I hate the business of writing, quite frankly. But making a chapbook, hey, I can do that. So I'm looking at actually doing another one this summer. Because it's it's a really easy way. Like young Ryan Wield from Regina, he just put out his own chapbook of his poetry, and he was one of the young people I published in spring when I edited Spring. So there's lots of young people coming up, and it's so great to help them along.
Paul, did you have any thoughts to add about the youth in Saskatchewan and maybe particularly rurally?
No, I think we've covered it. We talked about I think one of the issues just rurally is internet access, and certainly as we're doing here with the pandemic, is as writers, as poets, relying on the internet, on our connection, whether it's Zoom or Google Meets or whatever, to build our community. So I just think that the technology and the internet and our smartphones are all essential writing tools now.
I have to say, I was at the Royal Ontario Museum, Art Gallery of Ontario. Down in the basement, there was an Indigenous artist who was doing workshops online with 2 different classrooms in remote communities. And I just think there is so much potential for that, and I think the kids are getting something out of it. But there is no replacement for the mentoring that goes on when you have a live human being in front of you. So that's one of the things we are missing.
We have 2 questions left, so we're going to go a tiny bit over. But the second last question, the penultimate question, is if you're going to give young people who love books one reason to stay in Saskatchewan, what would you say?
You will not be supported better than you are here anywhere else in this country.
Even if you're in the diaspora, I'm still not supported anywhere else better than I am in Saskatchewan. I agree. It's just there's so much energy because of the connection and the community and the friendships. It creates a really supportive environment to write.
I think the other thing I would say is that you have access to other disciplines that you don't have in other places. And visual artists, and you can know these people. It's not like you're like sending out emails to people you never met. These are people you know. And I think I love the fact that a kid growing up in a lot of places in this province will know writers and artists, and it's just a job. I mean, that would be the greatest compliment if we thought that being an artist or a writer was that's a job.
Any thoughts, Paul, why you would recommend a young person to stay in Saskatchewan if they love books and writing?
Well, I would say because, as Bruce and Bernadette said, it's in a special place. I do think we tend to focus a bit on Saskatoon and Regina a bit, and recognize there's also communities north of Prince Albert where there are strong traditions of oral narrative and writing. So for me, we still have a ways to go, even as a province, in terms of being encompassing of, particularly in the north of the north.
And hopefully that's continuing to change quickly. And by even next year, we'll have more, have grown in that way when we meet again. The last question someone asked me is, could someone speak to the SAWCI and Shock Festival?
SAWCI, the Saskatchewan Aboriginal Writers. Oh, I can't remember what SAWCI stands for, but it's the Aboriginal Writers Circle.
And have any of you been to it? Or are any of you involved?
Yeah.
Well, the Guild has a partnership with them right now for our Indigenous officer.
Yeah. And I was actually at a conference they put on just past November on Indigenous writing, and it was a good one. And sorry to say there weren't a few more pale faces there, but it was a really good conference. And I think it's a biannual, every second year, I believe they do it. And it's important for writers and others, fans of writing, to get out to these events. I mean, if you want to, I just think it's important to be there, and you learn so much. And it's the writing is great, and it's a very welcoming place, and they appreciate you coming for sure.
Excellent. Thank you. I had hoped at some point we would talk a bit about Caddo, but there were so many things that I hoped we'd talk about. The hour goes by so fast. So instead of, mourning Caddo's demise or departure, I will just say that that's where I met some of my first Saskatchewan writers. Bonnie Bernard, I read through Caddo, and again, a revelation that people could write about prairie things and prairie people, and that it would be such great literature. So that was very important to me. And, the work of Jeanette Lyons, they published, and Alison Calder, and so many writers Caddo has published. So, they did great work for a long time. It's sad to see them go.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you all so much. Thank you for your work, and thank you for joining us today, and thank you for being part of the Saskatchewan literary community. I'm going to finish with a couple announcements. Book sales are being extended. So Post Horizon booksellers in Moose Jaw are going to have the festival books in stock for a full week. And books can also still be purchased online by McNally Robinson, and a portion of those proceeds goes back to the festival. So if you want to run out and buy these 3 brilliant authors' books, you can still do so. I want to really thank the staff: Sarah Simison, Executive Director; Amanda Farnell, Operations Coordinator; Administrative Assistant Lucinda McLean; and summer interns Emily Pinter and Bryson Williams. It looks like it went so smoothly, but I cannot imagine that they did not have stresses behind the scenes. So congratulations to you all for pulling off a wonderful first virtual festival. It's 24 years. Also, a thanks to the board of directors, a special nod to Bob Curry, who was on the board for 24 years. Mr. Curry, he doesn't like when I call him that because he hasn't been Mr. Curry for a very long time, but I went to the school, so I think of him that way. Also a wonderful writer in his own right, and so supportive of Saskatchewan literary culture. He's stepping down from the board, but he's still going to work with the organization in other ways. So sincere gratitude, Bob, for all your years of hard work and dedication. And you're such a key part of this festival, and I know you will continue to be a key part. Thank you everyone for coming and for logging in online. And if we can say one benefit of the virtual format, I know people have tuned in from all over. Yesterday I heard from Carolyn Adderson, who had watched the session with Joan, and from Andrea Schroeder. And so writers are dialing in from all over the country, and readers as well. And so that's one benefit of this format. And thanks everybody for dialing in. Normally we only announce 3 or 4 writers that are going to be coming in the next year, but this year we have a bit of a longer list. It's going to be the 25th anniversary. So it's an extra special festival for all of us. And the confirmed authors list so far for 2021, I'm especially excited to announce the first name on the list, which is Angie Abdou. So, yay! I'm very excited. I will be coming. I always love coming home, especially when I have a new book. So I can't wait to see everybody. And that makes me even more excited to announce the rest of the list, because I know I will get to spend time with them. And that is Sharon Butella, one of the first living writers I ever met, Farzana Doctor from Toronto, Will Ferguson, funny writer. Harold Johnson, speaking of University of Regina's great press, right? We all love the work Harold's doing through there. Sylvia Legree, Griffin award-winning poet. Lyndon Penner, J.L. Richardson from the Festival of the Literary Diversity. Also, I think she has a novel coming. She's author of Stone's Thrower. Linda Spalding, and Guy Vanderhey so far. So what a list. I can't wait. And I can't wait to be in Crescent Park under the trees and looking at the swans. Thank you all so much.